You are my secret, a timeless love unearthed in silence, bound by a hidden pact, and carried through generations by two strangers fated to meet. A story of ancestral longing, lost history, and the quiet reverence between a curator and a seeker who shared a secret the world was never meant to know. From the moment Elena first noticed the man lingering in the east wing of the gallery, she sensed an undercurrent of something unspoken stirring within her world. He wasn't like the others who roamed through exhibitions with idle interest or practiced admiration. His eyes searched not for beauty, but for answers, tracking every detail, every stroke, as though trying to unearth a voice buried beneath centuries of silence. There was a stillness to him that unsettled her, a quiet reverence that suggested a personal grief, or perhaps a secret too heavy to name. She told herself it was nothing, but in the days that followed, he returned. He arrived each night just before closing, when the air settled into a hush and the crowds had thinned. He moved like a shadow, drifting through rooms thick with candle glow and age. He always found his way back to the same portrait, a woman seated in pale blue velvet, her expression unreadable, her gaze fixed on something just beyond the canvas. Elena knew the piece well. It was titled Lady in Frost, painted by a reclusive master whose works rarely offered clues to their subjects. But something in the man's stare suggested he saw more than pigment and posture. He saw a memory, or perhaps a warning. Curiosity drew her near. She watched from a distance, noting how he lingered at the corners of the painting, studying the frame, tracing faint cracks in the varnish with his eyes. Once, she found him slipping a small notebook back into his coat, its leather cover worn thin. She pretended not to notice. Instead, she reviewed her own records, drawn to the faint whisper of mystery she now associated with the portrait. Its provenance was murky at best, gifted anonymously to the gallery 2 decades ago, accompanied by a letter that had long since disappeared. No family, no legacy, just a name scrawled on the back of the canvas. For R. When Elena next saw him, it was no longer a coincidence. It was an inevitability. His visits had become part of the gallery's rhythm, an echo she waited for even if she wouldn't admit it aloud. She adjusted the lights differently and arranged closing schedules so she could pass by unnoticed. Yet somehow, she always felt him notice her. Not with words, but with the stillness that descended when she entered the room. It was a quiet communion, one she never dared break. Until one night, as the city sighed under winter's breath, she found herself standing beside him, breathing the same dusty air, heart knocking quietly in her chest. She learned his name through archived letters, newspaper clippings, and old ledgers she unearthed from the gallery's dusty basement. The man was Raphael Marek, a scholar once affiliated with a now-defunct institute that explored ancestral archives, historical secrets, and disputed artifacts. He had published a few pieces on aristocratic families whose lineages had been obscured or erased. His name vanished after a scandal involving a forged family diary, though he had insisted it was authentic. His reputation had faded into footnotes, his career swallowed by suspicion. Now he had reappeared, seeking something no one else believed existed. What he sought, Elena would later learn, was a lost inheritance not of wealth, but of truth. The woman in the portrait was rumored to be connected to Raphael's bloodline, her story a thread tied to a forbidden pact once made in the shadow of empire. That pact, whispered in the margins of old correspondence and hinted at in rare manuscripts, spoke of 2 lovers, one noble, one exiled, who had conspired to protect each other from betrayal. Their love, dangerous and disavowed, had been sealed not in public vows, but in a written oath, hidden away before it could be destroyed. If the portrait was real, it might be the final map to that forgotten covenant. Elena, swept into the gravity of his search, began to help. She told herself it was the mystery, the allure of academic discovery, and the desire to preserve history. But it was more than that. Something in Raphael's silence spoke to her own quiet ache for connection, her yearning to matter beyond labels and titles. They became companions in secrecy, piecing together fragments late into the night. The gallery transformed into their sanctuary, their confessional. While others saw dusty archives and faded paint, Elena saw breadcrumbs left by ghosts, and Raphael saw her. Together, they discovered subtle clues embedded in the portrait's frame carvings that matched the shape of symbols found in an old ledger tied to Raphael's family name. They traced letters inked in foreign tongues and found sealed envelopes stashed in books no one had opened in decades. Slowly, a map began to form. One night, buried inside a hollow of the wooden panel behind the painting, they unearthed a parchment sealed in wax. It bore the emblem of a forgotten order and a signature that sent tremors through Raphael's hands. The parchment referenced a manor on the outskirts of the city, long abandoned, said to house the final testament of that hidden love. The journey there was cloaked in mist and unease. The estate loomed like a memory buried too long, its iron gates bent, its walls crumbling under ivy. Wind whispered through shattered windows, and the air inside was thick with the scent of mildew and regret. Elena's breath trembled as she stepped over fallen beams and creaking floorboards. She didn't know what they would find, but she knew what it meant to look. Beneath the parlor, behind a cracked hearth, Raphael found it. A hidden compartment, sealed in stone, sheltering a satchel worn by time. Inside was the Pact, and with it, a letter. The parchment inside the satchel was brittle, the ink faded but legible. It recounted a forbidden union between two lovers, one the daughter of an exiled aristocrat, the other a young man disowned for his allegiance to the wrong crown. They had written their vow in defiance of the empires that sought to control them, swearing to protect each other's memory, even if history erased them. The letter addressed Raphael by name as though the past had been waiting for him. It spoke of lineage, redemption, and the hope that someone would someday tell their story. Elena watched Raphael read it with hands that trembled, his expression unraveling into something she could not name. Awe, grief, wonder, all of it pulsing beneath his skin. At that moment, she understood the cost of secrets. She had thought them romantic, even beautiful. But they were burdens too, passed from generation to generation, waiting for someone to uncover them without being consumed. She wanted to speak, to ask what it meant for him, for them, for everything they had shared, but he said nothing. Instead, he left. He disappeared before sunrise, leaving only the satchel and silence. Elena remained behind in the ruin, surrounded by the dust of another century's tragedy. The letter lay folded beside her, its words already etched into her memory. She stared at the hearth, the empty walls, and the silence he had left her with. Part of her felt foolish, perhaps. She had let herself fall into someone else's story. But part of her knew she had changed, too. She had felt history stir through her fingertips. She had held a love that defied erasure. When she returned to the gallery, the portrait felt different. Not just a painting now, but a portal, a witness. She resumed her curating work in silence, her routine slipping back into normalcy. But nothing was normal. Her eyes drifted off into the frame, to the signature, to the place where once secrets had waited to be unearthed. She avoided questions from colleagues, skipped social events, and let her nights become quiet again. Yet every night she wondered, where had Raphael gone? Had he abandoned the story they had uncovered, or was he preparing to reveal it to the world? Weeks passed before he returned. It was a gala night, a grand reopening of the gallery's west wing. Elena was dressed in silver silk, guiding patrons through corridors of opulence and curated light. She moved like someone distant from herself, smiling politely, accepting compliments. And then she saw Raphael, standing in the archway, holding the satchel. He was thinner, quieter, and changed. But his eyes held something new, resolution. He approached her like the return of memory. In the middle of the gala crowd, they stood together, curator and seeker, history and witness. He had come back not for the gallery, but for her. And the satchel, he said, wasn't his to keep. The story belonged to both of them now. In the days that followed, Elena helped him authenticate the documents. Genealogical research confirmed the woman in the portrait was Raphael's great-great-grandmother. The pact was real. Historians who once doubted him now invited him to panels and forums. He asked Elena to co-curate an exhibition dedicated to the discovery. She hesitated not because she didn't want to, but because she didn't know what it would mean for them. Their journey had been intimate, sacred. To share it with the world would be like tearing open a wound that hadn't yet healed. Still, she agreed. They called the exhibition A Love Hidden, The Lost Pact. It would feature the portrait, the satchel, the letter, and Raphael's lineage traced through archival maps and restored documents. The gallery transformed into a stage for their story, each display case glowing with fragments of defiance and devotion. It was no longer a mystery. It was history reborn. On the opening night, Elena stood beside Raphael as guests drifted through the exhibit, whispering reverently. The portrait shone under soft lights. The letter lay under glass, delicate as breath. People pointed, read, and lingered. The story they had unearthed was no longer secret. But in her heart, Elena knew that the most powerful parts were still unspoken. The quiet hours spent decoding meaning in faded ink, and the gravity of standing in a ruined estate beside a man who shook with memory. She had helped him reclaim his heritage, but along the way she had found something else, a space where truth and emotion collided, a space where she no longer had to hide behind her profession. She had always been a curator of other people's stories. Now, she has become part of one. As the exhibit's success grew, Raphael and Elena were asked to travel to tell the tale in other cities and other countries. They agreed tentatively, then with certainty. At each stop, Elena retold the narrative with new layers, each time revealing more of what they had endured. And though she spoke without tears, her voice always held the weight of what wasn't said. the nights of silence, the absence after discovery, and the ache of wondering if they had become a story themselves. The success of the exhibition transformed more than the gallery, it transformed them. Where once they had shared a sacred silence beneath vaulted ceilings and dust-covered archives, now they stood beneath spotlights and camera flashes. Journalists asked questions designed for spectacle, not reverence. The story of the Forbidden Pact was retold with increasing gloss, its heart slowly eroded by retellings that favored drama over truth. Elena adjusted to the role of storyteller with practiced grace, her voice measured, her expressions serene. But inside, something had begun to shift. The intimacy of what they had uncovered together, once so personal, so tender, now felt distant. The fragments of parchment, the faded ink, and the quiet ache of secrets long buried had become objects behind glass. The story was still theirs, but now it belonged to everyone. Raphael thrived in the attention, not in arrogance, but in something more complex, a vindication long denied. For years he had chased shadows, ridiculed for believing in stories no one could see. Now the world embraced him as a descendant of forbidden love, the inheritor of a history that once cost lives. He moved through interviews with poise, his voice filled with conviction. Yet as he spoke of lineage and legacy, Elena began to feel the growing distance between them, not physical, but emotional. They had shared the pursuit, the moment of unearthing. But now they stood on opposite sides of what it had become. They traveled to European cities where aristocratic bloodlines were still revered, where cathedrals whispered stories through their stone bones. Each new exhibit brought new interpretations, each new audience a different lens through which to view the past. In Paris, the Pact was romanticized as rebellion. In Vienna, it was a political allegory. In Florence, it became art itself. Elena stood in silent agreement as the story morphed, never correcting what was softened or reimagined. She understood that history was never preserved. It was reinterpreted, reassembled, and retold. Yet in the quiet spaces between cities, when the crowds disappeared and the press fell silent, Elena felt the weight of the original secret pressing against her ribs. She found herself waking in unfamiliar hotel rooms with the scent of dust in her lungs. Memories of Raphael's trembling hands as he read the letter still vivid behind her eyes. Sometimes she watched him from across the room, surrounded by curators and scholars, and felt like a bystander to her own life. Their connection, once forged in whispered nights and half-lit halls, was now defined by shared schedules and structured narratives. They still moved together, still shared thoughts in knowing glances, but the emotional rawness had softened into something more distant. What once was quiet understanding had become polite silence. Elena began to wonder if it had always been this way, if she had projected more meaning into those early nights than truly existed. She thought often of the satchel. They kept it with them, always. Sometimes in his bag, sometimes in her briefcase. It no longer held its secrets, but its weight still carried memory. One night, during a rare pause in their itinerary, Elena held it in her hands and felt the ghost of their first discovery rise like breath against her skin. The leather was dry, the edges worn smooth. She placed it on the table and walked away, unable to bear its presence. When she returned, it was gone. Raphael had taken it to another room, perhaps out of respect, perhaps to protect her from the past she hadn't asked to inherit. As the final leg of the exhibition tour approached, they returned to the gallery where it all began. The portrait of the woman in blue had been carefully restored, her frost-toned eyes clearer than ever. The room was prepared with quiet reverence, the light adjusted to the precise hue that first framed their encounter. Elena stood before the painting for a long time, her hands clasped behind her back, the air thick with memory. It was as if time had folded over itself, the beginning and the end colliding in this one moment of stillness. Visitors filed in, and with them, the press. A televised feature was scheduled for the evening. Elena reviewed her notes, her mind dulled by routine. But when she glanced up, she saw Raphael standing beside the portrait, his expression unreadable. Something in his posture had changed, softer, warier, touched by reflection. She approached slowly, the silence between them no longer strained but softened by time. That evening during the broadcast, Raphael offered a closing statement that surprised her. He spoke not of legacy or proof, but of memory, the kind that exists not in documents, but in quiet presence. He acknowledged the woman in the portrait not just as an ancestor, but as a symbol of love that defied convention and of truth buried and finally unearthed. And he spoke of those who had helped bring the story to light, not as assistants, but as keepers of the flame. Elena stood at his side listening, her chest tightening. After the cameras left, the guests departed, and the lights dimmed, the gallery returned to its quiet state. Elena remained in the room, watching the portrait as she had done so many times before. The silence was no longer lonely, but full. She sat on a bench, the leather satchel at her feet, her thoughts adrift in the tide of what they had become. She realized in that moment that the secret had never truly belonged to either of them. It had chosen them as vessels, conduits through which it could be spoken, one final time. In the following weeks, the exhibition was dismantled, the pieces returned to their respective homes. The satchel was donated to the gallery, encased in a new display beside the letter and the painting. Elena declined to be part of the unveiling. She needed distance not from the story, but from the emotion that had carried her too far from herself. She took leave from the gallery, traveling alone to coastal towns where no one knew her name. She wandered through quiet libraries and sunlit ruins, letting the days unfold without purpose. She no longer chased secrets. She simply let them rest. In her solitude, she thought often of Raphael, not with bitterness but with clarity. He had been a chapter in her life, just as she had been in his. They had not promised each other anything. They had simply followed the thread of a forgotten love, and in doing so, created a story of their own. Months later, she returned to the gallery. The portrait still hung where it had always been. The satchel rested in its case, accompanied by a plaque describing its significance. Visitors moved slowly through the room, pausing before the display. Elena stood unnoticed among them, her presence just another shadow. She read the description once, then again. Her name appeared at the bottom as curator, co-author, and historian, but those words felt small compared to what she had lived. As she turned to leave, her gaze lingered on the woman in blue. The portrait's eyes, ever fixed on some distant sorrow, now seemed softer, less haunted, and more resolved. Elena smiled faintly. She had seen those eyes in herself once, in moments of uncertainty and longing. Now they no longer mirrored her. They had told their story, and so had she. In the years that followed, Elena continued her work, but on her own terms. She chose projects with care, favoring stories that had been overlooked, silenced, or forgotten. She taught students how to listen to the spaces between facts, to honor what could not be proven but still felt true. She never spoke publicly of Raphael again, but in quiet moments she still thought of him, of the way history had drawn them together, and of the way life had allowed them to part without bitterness. Their story lived on not just in exhibitions or published essays, but in the gentle hush of late galleries, in the pause before turning a fragile page, and in the quiet realization that some secrets are not meant to be solved, only carried. Elena carried hers with grace, not as a burden, but as a reminder that sometimes the most profound connections are the ones never spoken aloud. And so, in a room lined with golden light, beneath the gaze of a woman whose story had once been forgotten, Elena walked alone, no longer searching, no longer waiting. She had lived the secret, unearthed it, and honored it, and now she let it rest.